I want to spend the bulk of my time talking about China-India relations in the context of what it means to the U.S. But before I get to that, very briefly, Ben flagged for me an issue that maybe hasn't been getting quite enough attention here, but I suspect will very soon, and that is the subject of Narendra Modi. India has national elections coming up next year. They have to be held by the spring of next year. And it's increasingly likely that the candidate from the opposition BJP party will take the prime ministership. India's elections are notoriously difficult to predict, but all the trends are moving in that direction. Now, we have a problem because Modi is banned from entering the United States. He has not been able to receive a visa since 2001 to come here. Long story short, he was sworn in as chief minister of a large Indian state of Gujarat in 2001. And within a few months of him assuming office, there was a terrible incident in which a train full of mostly Hindus was attacked by a mob of mostly Muslims. And the Muslims burned this train to the ground with several hundred people inside. Horrific incident. There was a wave of backlash against Muslim families in the region. Terrible violence followed for the next several days. Both parties participated, but the Muslims took the brunt of it. He was accused by human rights groups at the time for having taken part in this, for not doing more to stop the violence. Frankly, my own impression is that he probably sat on the sidelines a bit too long while this was going on. But he has been cleared by several inquiries inside India of any wrongdoing. He is welcomed in European capitals and other capitals around the world. Diplomats at the ambassador level are allowed to speak with him. And at some point a few years ago, human rights groups, many of them left-leaning, but some Republican congressmen as well, decided that it would be good to revoke this man's visa when he was the governor of Gujarat, which at the time didn't raise many hackles. Now he may be the prime minister of an allied country, and I find it very difficult for us to apply this standard to him, to someone who has been cleared of all wrongdoing inside his own country, when we allow people like Putin and even Ahmadinejad to come into this country, and we're denying Modi a visa. And the problem is there's talk of revoking it, but at some point it becomes too little too late and the damage is already done. So this is an issue, I think, that should be on everybody's radar. It would be a terrible shame to sour a budding strategic partnership over an issue like this, especially if really no one else in the world is applying this standard to him. The State Department has been just obstinate and sort of refused to deal with this issue anytime we or others of a similar mind have pressed on it. But let's talk about China-India for a moment. India doesn't get quite as much press in the context of China, particularly in recent years, and for good reason. I mean, it's been China's maritime territorial disputes and China's dispute with Japan and the South China Sea that have occupied our attention, which, again, rightfully so. I'd note that we had a Chinese guest in a few weeks ago from Kicker, which is a think tank tied to the Chinese intelligence ministries. And his signal, this was about 3 days before they announced the ADIZ, and his messaging to us was pretty clear, and it was that the dispute with Japan is a deadly serious affair. You need to be taking this very seriously. We understand your position and your treaty commitments to Japan, and quite frankly, that will not prevent us from enforcing our national interests. So, we want you to know how deadly serious we take this, and we want you to know that we will not be tempered in our behavior because of your supposed commitment to Japan. He talked of the potential for a new Cold War if this goes south. So this is something they're taking very seriously. I don't think they're posturing on Japan. The South China Sea is a little different, but with Japan, this is a very emotional, very important issue to them. and something that we need to be prepared for if it turns ugly. But nevertheless, even if it's below the headlines, I think that if we consider China to be our greatest potential security threat in the 21st century, many do, interstate security threat at least, then I think India has a very big role to play in our foreign policy. And I say that for 4 reasons, if I can boil it down quickly. The book I wrote was really about taking a deep dive into the China-India relationship and examining all the specific elements of rivalry in the 21st century. But I just want to focus on sort of what's relevant to the U.S. here. So this is why I think India matters. First, India is even more concerned about China's rise than we are. And I'll go through these in greater detail. Second, because India has the capabilities to be a very useful partner. Third, because India has geography on its side in the China context. And fourth, because I think the trend in the India-U.S. relationship is toward greater cooperation. I think the long-term fundamentals are very good, even if we get hung up and we have minor setbacks a little too frequently. So why is India even more concerned about China's rise than we are? Well, A, they're much weaker relative to China than we are, and B, they're much closer to the blast radius if something goes wrong. India was humiliated by China in a 1962 border war, and they believe China still claims 90,000 square kilometers of Indian territory. It's the largest border dispute in the world. And they believe that China may one day come in and teach them another lesson, initiate another short border war to seize territory. China claims Indian territory on the southern rim of Tibet that they believe was wrongly taken from China by the British. So there is the possibility, this is a border that is increasingly militarized, by the way. India recently upgraded its forces there, the largest permanent deployment of forces to the China border since the border war. I mean, they moved 2 mountain divisions in 2009, and they just announced this year they're going to send in a 50,000-man offensive strike corps. I mean, these are large military formations, a big buildup along the China-India border. That's something that we need to be aware of, even if it doesn't always make the headlines here. But they're clearly concerned. They're clearly concerned about China's intentions, and they see how China's behavior has been in its maritime territorial disputes and worry that when Chinese nationalists are, if Taiwan is eventually integrated, if they achieve their goals in the South China Sea, or if they just need to deflect attention from some domestic problems, the Chinese nationalists turn their attention on the India border dispute, and Chinese behavior becomes more aggressive. They already, India counts several hundred violations of the line of actual control every year, and there was a very public one earlier this year where a Chinese patrol set up camp inside Indian territory for 3 weeks and refused to leave. So this is an active issue. Because India has the capabilities to be a very useful partner. Now, I think it's important to remember we talk about China and India in the same club a lot of times because they both have over 1 billion people. They're both in Asia. But the gap between China and India is as great as the gap between China and the U.S. China is very far ahead of India, and that gap is widening even more. But India has the capabilities of a major Asian power. India has been operating, in particular, aircraft carriers now for decades. While China just fielded its first aircraft carrier, India has tremendous experience operating aircraft carriers and will have 3 much quicker than China will. They're currently building their first indigenous aircraft carriers, and the first one received an important milestone this year. I think it should be in the water within 5 years. Their Navy is sort of praised by U.S. seamen and other international navies as being very forward-leaning, very aggressive, and they have very significant capabilities. And that's tied to the third point, which is that India has geography. India's great advantage with China is that it is positioned between China and most of its oil suppliers in the Middle East. So almost all of China's oil imports come through the Strait of Malacca. They originate in the Middle East or in Africa. They travel through the Strait of Malacca, which means they have to pass through the Indian Ocean. India, in addition to that, has this string of islands right at the mouth of the Strait of Malacca called the Andaman and Nicobar Islands that most people have never heard of, but could be critically important in any conflict with China in the future. Essentially means that any oil coming into China from the Middle East has to pass through the exclusive economic zone of these Indian islands, which have several military bases on them. So India is in a very advantageous position inside the Indian Ocean where China's oil imports must pass through should they ever want to. Now, it's more difficult to sort of interdict China's oil supplies or cut off their oil in practice than it is in theory. But nevertheless, they do have asymmetric advantages in the forms of a strong navy, in the forms of being positioned ideally between China and its energy supplies. China, on the other hand, would have a much more difficult time pursuing that similar strategy with India because most of India's oil supplies also originate in the Middle East. And the last one is because I think the long-term prospects of Indo-U.S. ties are very good. Now, if you saw this week, it's a very typical example of what often happens in the India-U.S. relationship. There was an Indian consular official in Manhattan who was arrested after taking her children to school for violations of, she was essentially underpaying domestic help below minimum wage and had falsified visa documents to get her here. And she was arrested and she was strip searched. And there was a huge uproar in India over how she was treated. There's cultural sensitivities at play here. But, I mean, they took very dramatic steps. They brought bulldozers into Delhi and removed the security barriers in front of the United States Embassy there. And they revoked all kind of privileges for U.S. diplomats inside India. Frankly, this is the type of thing where I think they make a big fuss and it blows over. But beyond these sort of day-to-day, you know, this intrigue and these diplomatic rows, the long-term fundamentals are very good. Indian youth are among the most pro-American of, you know, any foreigners polled by our polling guys here. I mean, just interacting with them, their vibrance, the Indian American community is huge and growing. They all support closer Indo-U.S. relations. This is something, I might add, that both Republicans and Democrats agree on, which is very rare, very hard to find in this town. I mean, everybody thinks a stronger partnership with India is a good thing for us in the long term, and that is reciprocated on the Indian side. Their Congress and BJP parties both support a stronger partnership with the U.S. So I'm happy to field any questions about China, India. I just wanted to give you sort of a basic rundown of where I see India in this equation and why I think it's helpful and it's important to us.
Jeff, thanks. Can I ask a question first on the current state of the relationship between India and Russia, which has historically been their kind of non-aligned / anti-American angle. Obviously, with the rise of China and the difficulties Russia's had in recent years, that's changed a bit. But where is that partnership on weapons sales and strategic relations more generally?
So India was looked at, I think, as a Soviet client for much of the Cold War, and it did little to disabuse us of that notion. But I think it's important to remember that, you know, when India came into being, it was threatened by China, the 1962 border war, and it turned to the United States for help, and we did help. We were a participant in that war on India's side. And we formed sort of this tactical partnership with Delhi, and we began selling them quite a bit of arms in the aftermath of the war. In 1965, India went to war with Pakistan, and we immediately cut off everything to them and to Pakistan. In 1971, we had an opening to China, India's main enemy. And India was about to fight a war, its third war with Pakistan. and it saw the United States and China and Pakistan getting together, and it thought, I only have one other guy I can turn to watch my back. So it turned to the Soviet Union. I don't think that that was sort of this great meshing of ideologies and there was this deep commitment there. I think it was more a matter of convenience and balance of power politics. And I think you've seen that since the Soviet Union collapsed, the relationship has taken a significant downturn. Now, that's not to say relations aren't good. They are. That's because the Indian military is mostly equipped with Soviet-made weaponry. But I'll tell you, the Indian military also has tremendous regrets about that because Soviet and now Russian-made military hardware has performed very, very poorly for them, particularly the MiG fighter aircraft. And they are very upset and discontented with the Russian military-industrial complex and how it's been, which is why you see them beginning to turn more and more toward the United States, the Israelis, who are now one of the biggest arms trade partners with India, and European countries. They want to get away from Russian equipment because when you single source to somebody like that and they won't give you spare parts and they up the ante on every new piece of military hardware. In fact, India bought a Russian-built carrier, the Admiral Gorshkov, in 2004, and it was supposed to be delivered 4 years ago at $1 billion, and now it's at $3 billion, and it's still not ready. So, the relationship is still there, but I think they're looking for alternatives, and they're very glad to have the United States and others there.
Good. Questions? Marshall?
This kind of dovetails with your history.
Yeah.
What are the Chinese relationships with Pakistan?
Yeah. Great question. Very good. If you look around the world and ask, who are China's friends? What countries consider themselves friends of China, or does China consider friends? There's almost no one. It's really just Pakistan. That is their number one, probably warmest external relationship. And obviously one of India's biggest concerns. China has been supplying them with military hardware. China was instrumental in helping Pakistan achieve a nuclear weapons capability in the early 90s, may have even tested Pakistan's first nuclear bomb. And in fact, the Indians will tell you that all this terrorism that we've been facing in Kashmir over the past decade, that only began in the early 90s, and that only began after Pakistan achieved a nuclear weapons capability and had a nuclear umbrella. So they sort of have China to thank for that. There are some strains in the relationship. It's not all rosy. China's biggest concern is about terrorism because the Uyghurs who live in China's northwest are largely Muslim and largely opposed to Chinese rule. And some of them have training camps inside Pakistan. We've targeted some of them for China, on China's behalf, taken out Uyghur leaders in Pakistan's tribal areas. But, I've had Chinese scholars and officials who have been very candid with me who have said things like, we're friendly with Pakistan because we have to be. Frankly, we're a little afraid of what happens if that country goes south or if they decide to stop crackdowns on Islamist militants that are offensive to us. We don't really care what they do with militants that attack the U.S. or India. That doesn't concern us. But we know there's some guys in there that could cause trouble for us, so it's our imperative to make sure that Pakistan does everything to crack down on them. But other than that, I'd say relations are good. Not always to our benefit. In fact, rarely to our benefit.
Fred Fleitz with the Center for Security Policy. I want to ask you to comment on two things. One, have you heard anything about cyber attacks by China against India, especially the Indian military? And second, what can you say about the Chinese string of pearls strategy to gain access to ports in the Indian Ocean?
Great questions. The first question I'll answer very briefly, and that's yes. I see reports coming out of India frequently about Chinese cyber attacks on very senior ranking government officials, on military industrial complex, and frankly on the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan exile community in India. That's sort of the one big, that's the 800-pound gorilla in the room. China is most concerned about India because India hosts the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan exile community. And if it wanted to, and if the Tibetan exile community became more militant, they could cause real problems for China in an area where it feels very vulnerable, which is in Tibet. So yes, cyber attacks are a major concern for them. In fact, it's something that they would like to work more closely with us on, but they feel like they've been burned a few times because they've noticed the NSA had hacked into X person's account and suddenly they don't trust us anymore. That's happened actually on a few occasions. But again, in the long term, they are as concerned about it as we are, and there should be a commonality of interest there. String of pearls is something that occupied a lot of attention over the past decade. Is China building a rim of military bases and getting reciprocal military agreements from countries along the Indian Ocean rim? When you take a deep dive and look at it, what you find is that most of these arrangements it's made have been exclusively commercial in nature, that they've not carried an explicit military arrangement with it, at least not yet. And there's some reasoning behind this. First is that the strategy is principally to try and help solve their Malacca dilemma, which is that they want to reduce their dependence on all this oil coming through one bottleneck in the Strait of Malacca, because they know that that's where the U.S. and others could have a significant advantage and could cause them real problems in the event of a war. So they want to do whatever they can to build pipelines, build a road and rail network through Central Asia, through Pakistan, through Burma, any way they can get energy supplies up through the subcontinent rather than through maritime shipping lanes is a benefit to them. But, and again, it was easy not to seek explicit military arrangements when your Navy doesn't really have the capability to operate for a large, extended period of time in the Indian Ocean. But I do worry that this is changing. I mean, in 2008, China sent its first major foreign naval deployment, permanent deployment, out into the Indian Ocean to help fight piracy in the Gulf of Aden. Now, that's given them valuable experience operating in the Indian Ocean. And as you see them build the capabilities of a blue water navy, you have to imagine that they're going to become decreasingly content to rely on the United States and others to protect their shipping lanes to the Indian Ocean. And they're going to want to have a greater presence there. And these early arrangements with countries like Sri Lanka and Burma and Bangladesh could, in the next 10 years or so, pave the way for a more permanent or more explicitly military arrangement. So we sort of got ahead of ourselves a little bit when we first started looking at the string of pearls and thought this meant that China was coming into the Indian Ocean en masse. The funny thing is we may have been right. We may have just been about a decade or two behind. So that's how I see it.
Good. Yes, sir.
So how nervous is China about India aligning itself more with the United States, and what moves are they likely to make as they see that happening?
That's a great question. When I started looking at the China-India relationship, I saw that entering the 21st century, it was on a pretty serious upward trajectory. They signed two really important agreements on their disputed border in 2003 and 2005, and it looked like India was trying to weigh its options. The relationship with the U.S. was improving, the relationship with China was improving. It was kind of playing both sides and seeing which way to go. And then in the summer of 2005, it seemed like it made its choice. It signed a 10-year defense partnership with the U.S. that summer and signed the U.S.-India nuclear deal, which was very significant at the time. And following that decision, you saw China begin to take a series of steps, of provocative steps toward India. And many in India think that that was signaling to them, look, there will be costs of you moving too closely toward the U.S. border provocations, issuing stapled visas to Indian citizens from Kashmir, sort of questioning their status, maritime incidents in the South China Sea, issues relating to Tibet and the Dalai Lama. There's a series of sort of needling on Pakistan as well that was essentially interpreted as them messaging, look, there will be consequences for moving toward the U.S. and Japan. And their problem is that they're in a conundrum, because if they pursue carrots toward India, I'm sure India will reciprocate and cooperate on matters of mutual interest. But I don't think that's going to stop their gradual movement toward the U.S. I think that's almost inevitable. But if they try and become too punitive, I think that will only push India even more quickly toward the U.S. because they realize that we are their greatest hedge against Chinese power. So I think they're stuck in a bit of a dilemma, which is why you see like the China-India relationship in a bit of a roller coaster, where China will offer an olive branch one month and then you'll see a provocation the next month. I don't think they quite know how to stem the improvement of Indo-U.S. ties, but it is on their radar. And historically, India has not mattered as much to China as Japan and other countries in East Asia. It's only really mattered as it relates to Tibet and their vulnerabilities there. But India's partnership with the U.S. has given it substance and has made it matter in China's strategic calculus.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your briefing. I had the opportunity to live and work in both mainland China and India, and I've actually been in the offices of Kicker. So while I was in Kicker, oddly enough, we were discussing the Muslim issue, because the second largest ethnic group in mainland China are the Hui. And it was interesting to hear them discuss how they controlled their Muslim issue, and thus may explain also their alliance with Pakistan. But I wanted to ask you mostly, in the past year or so, Dr. Michael Pillsbury, who I consider one of our foremost accurate authorities on mainland China, he recently wrote an article that discusses China's greatest fears as relates to India and all of the surrounding countries around mainland China. Can you discuss that?
I actually have not seen the article, so I can't. But I can discuss what China's concerns are vis-a-vis India, and we've already sort of touched on them a bit. I would say first and foremost it is Tibet, and the Dalai Lama is based in Dharamsala, India, as you know. He's 78 years old right now. The Chinese have a strategy which is essentially to wait him out. They think once he passes that the Tibetan exile movement and the Tibetan movement in general will fracture, and that China will be able to handpick its own successor to the Dalai Lama and will essentially be able to consolidate its control over Tibetan Buddhism. I think that's probably the wrong bet. I think that, if anything, the Dalai Lama has served as a sort of mitigating factor to tamp down the passions of the Tibetan exile community. And this is something we all should be watching. Because when he goes, there's a very real chance that the Tibetan exile community becomes more militant, more aggressive, more provocative, and becomes more of a headache for China, and frankly drives China-India relations into a tailspin. So, and I think they know that that possibility is there. So I would say their biggest concern vis-a-vis India is that the Tibetan exile community becomes more active inside Tibet, causing trouble for China, and that India helps facilitate this. And again, there's not a lot of countries that can evoke fear out of China. It doesn't feel threatened by many countries. The U.S. is certainly one of them, maybe Japan, but there's not many others. India is one of them, despite all the sort of advantages China has in comprehensive national power. This Tibet question is a big one for them, and India really has the capability to stir significant trouble for them in Tibet if it chose to do so. So that's number one. And number two is its relationship with the U.S. China realizes that if India begins integrating with the security architecture of the United States in the Indo-Pacific, trilateral security arrangements with the U.S. and Japan, and improving relationship with Australia, improving relationship with Vietnam, that in concert, all these powers working together could pose a potentially insurmountable challenge to China. So I would say those are the two big ones, really, is Tibet and the U.S. And then there's certainly other issues at play, water, again, the terrorism issue, Pakistan, but those are the two big ones.
What else, Kevin?
Just wanted to make a quick point on the commercial side, and I don't know if you follow that at all, but there's a dispute over patent rights and the recognition of U.S. patents in India. Their Supreme Court, and it deals with pharmaceuticals, and their Supreme Court ruled against, essentially they're making knockoffs of U.S. patented medicines, and there are a bunch of members of Congress on letters that demand may be too strong a word, but demand that India, bring its patent system into conformity with international standards. And there are a number of other commercial issues. We don't know where they're going to go, and the Indians, have a fairly decent court system, fairly independent, that they inherited from the British and improved on. So I just want to make you aware of that if you're not aware of it. And pharmaceutical industry, biologics industry in the U.S., they've got some clout in Congress, and there are a bunch of members on these letters. So it's not, on the commercial side, it's not all roses right now.
No, that's a very fair point. I don't deal with the econ stuff. I imagine the view from that perspective is very different. It sounds like quite a bit of a headache, actually. But, from my stoop, looking at U.S. long-term national security interests, the trends are positive. Could that be undermined by, if the domestic issues become too contentious? Yeah, it could. And I think we need to be working very hard to sort of smooth over these differences, and they need to work hard too. It can't all be from one side. But I should, note as a caveat, when I speak about future prospects, it is from a narrow sort of foreign policy. Yeah, thank you.
Could I ask to reprise the question that I put to Peter a moment ago that I'd like your thoughts on as well, the relationship between the leadership, civilian leadership, Xi Jinping, and the military in China, and how that's likely to play out in this particular piece. He mentioned both the rising power of the military, of course, but also the possibility of social engineering as a safety valve for domestic difficulties in China. Would you sort of address those?
Sure. And I wish, frankly, that's the $800 million question. I wish I had a better answer for you, because everybody wants to know what is the balance of power between the civilians and the military. How much has the PLA become sort of an autonomous body, an autonomous power center in its own right? How much is the decision-making approved at the local level? I mean, these are the most fundamental questions about China today, which the smartest China watchers are digging every day to try and figure out. And I just think the best answer is we don't know. I think every time I think I have enough evidence to suggest it's moving in one direction, I get something that brings me back and says, no, the party has full control over these guys. They use them because it's convenient to make them sound like the bad cop, and we in the foreign ministry and the party are the good cop. So we play up the fact that, look, if you guys don't conform with what we want you to do, these PLA guys might come in and do something that we can't control, and that serves their interest. But there is a great deal of evidence to suggest that the nationalists in the PLA and their like-minded cohorts, especially the up-and-coming web generation, that's where some of the most fervent nationalists are. There's a lot to suggest that they can shape and, in some cases, initiate policy on the ground, which is dangerous. Because when you deal with Chinese officials and experts now, especially the younger class, you know, some of these guys, it's pretty clear, are not diehard ideological communists wishing for the end of the United States and, you know, working diligently every day to make that come about. I'm not as worried about them. They've been exposed to the West. They've been exposed. A lot of them just want economic development. They just want to enrich themselves and their family. That's fine. The PLA guys aren't like that. They have not been exposed to the West. They have not had Western education. They do not have exchanges with American officers at U.S. war colleges. They have a much more narrow, nationalistic, xenophobic mindset that genuinely could help lead to conflict with the U.S. in the future. That worries me. When we go to a foreign ministry-linked think tank when we're in China, we're showered with praise. We have lovely, flowery conversations. You know, it gets boring, frankly, sometimes. You go to a PLA-affiliated think tank, and these guys are stoic-faced. They resent the United States. They think we're doing everything we can to restrict China's rise and contain China. And it's a very different and, for us, very dangerous mindset. I wish I could say how influential they will be in the future, but I just don't know. It's potentially the most important question for us.